this is my studio assistant George, and this is what we're working on right now. This is a donkey in pastels. So we're going to be showing you how we do donkey fur, and we're only going to be using Faber-Castell Pitt pastel pencils. You can use any pastel pencils for this. And what I love about doing fur with pastels as opposed to colored pencils is their opacity. So you can actually layer lights on top of darks. In colored pencils you can't do that. So I'm going to take advantage of that and probably work here on his cheek and show you my process. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe to my channel. Alright, here we go. Got my donkey work in progress all ready to work on. I got my pastel pencils. I've got some grays, a black, a white, a brown, and a blue. Basically a lot of different colors, but mostly going to use browns and blues for the tints that I'm going to add in. Mostly blues for the darker areas. But the majority of the piece is just grayscale. So I like to start a new section in the fur with black or just a darker color and kind of start mapping in the darker shadows in the fur and the shapes. And then I go in and like to add lighter colors. That's why I was saying I prefer to use pastel pencils. Is the way I tend to work is put shadows in first and then get lighter and lighter as I go. And with colored pencils, you kind of have to work the other way around because they're not opaque. The lighter colors don't show on top of the darker colors very well. But here I get to start with darker colors and look at the fur kind of as shapes in and of themselves, like clumps. And I start by lightly mapping where those are. And so that's what I'm doing here, is I'm just lightly mapping out, very lightly really, and then sometimes I blend it with my finger there, just where the dark areas are in the fur. This doesn't have to be super precise. You're just kind of looking at your reference photo back and forth with the paper and noticing, okay, that's a dark area, and then you start kind of mapping where that is. It's really important for the entire time to be using pencil strokes in the direction of the fur. Even though you're thinking about the shape of the fur and the form of the animal, you're making sure that your strokes are in the direction it's going. And even if it's a bottom layer, because that'll show through in the end. So this gray is one of my mid-tones. It's not super light yet because I like to build up from darker colors. But the cool thing about pastel pencils is you can, it's so forgiving. It's really, really forgiving. You can go in too light and then go over it with dark later, as long as your pencil strokes are pretty light. So midtones are a pretty safe way to start with pastels. You can just go in there with midtones and lightly sketch out the direction of the fur. And yeah, the form takes shape as you go. But a really, really, really good tip with drawing is form before detail. So I keep that in mind a lot when I'm working, because a lot of people tend to start with detail and then you get lost and your form is flat. The animal doesn't look three-dimensional because you're just focusing on the fur. So donkey fur in particular, it's short, it's soft, it's pretty fluffy, so it's easy to get lost in all those cute little fur details. So in this stage, I'm just using various midtones. This is a lighter gray, so I'm mostly focusing on the higher light areas, and just following the direction of the fur as it appears in the reference photo. very lightly. I'm not too worried at this point about this being like the end tone or anything like that. It's going to get lighter and darker as I go, but it's giving me an idea of where the lights are, where the darks are, the general fur direction, and then form before detail. So that all the little hairs that you see on top of the animal come as you go closer to the end. Hope that makes sense. But basically, the way you look at fur is geometric shapes. So you don't see them as a bunch of little hairs. The little hairs are the detail that come after the form. You're looking first for the form, fur direction, and with that, the form of the fur clusters themselves. So there's a lot to be thinking about, but just think form before detail here. The form of the animal, and then the shapes of the fur itself. If you can see what I'm doing here is I'm kind of shading out and sketching out each tiny little fur clump. It's not just one little hair, but as I add more detail and I go over it, I define the hairs more in between each little clump. So that's how I look at fur, especially with fur like this. It's short. There's a lot of opportunity here for shading little clumps of fur. So don't get too carried away with the furs themselves. It's hard to remember that, but think about the animal underneath the fur and the shape of the animal as you go, and the shapes of the fur clumps themselves. I should do a separate video just on fur clumps, what that means. But you're basically just sketching out a bunch of little shapes like you see in the fur. You don't just see a bunch of hairs on an animal. You see shapes of the clusters of hair going in different directions, and then there's individual shading on the hairs in between those clumps. And so you're not looking at it like, oh, this is an animal that I'm just drawing and it's got all kinds of fur and here we go, drawing furs. You have to kind of back up and look at it like a bunch of form and shape. And then where the light hits, where it doesn't hit, even on the clusters of fur. And that's how it's going to look realistic at the end. But beginners tend to just go in and forget that and just put a bunch of hairs. And that's the difference between something that looks flat and something that actually looks like it has depth. You're building layer by layer, basically. So I'm going back in with dark right now. I think I'm still using black here. Yeah. And just further lightly defining where the darkest parts of his face are. And the darker parts of his face, so lower on his cheek, when I'm working on, it's not nearly as bright as his forehead. Those darks and midtones are going to be darker than the darks and midtones in a lighter area. So I can use more black and dark gray and brown and blue, darker shades of those things in the darker area here on his cheek. But I wouldn't go this dark, as you can see the top of his cheek. So your midtones will vary a lot, and the shading of them will vary a lot based on if you're in a dark area or not. Which this is a dark area, so. That's what I love about pastels too. So forgiving. Okay, here's blue. Going in with some blue here just to kind of add a tone, I guess. Have some type of realism, not realism, some interest to the piece. You don't want it to just be black and gray. Well, you can. It can be black and gray, but I like to add some blues in there because it really brings it to life. There's very rarely just, well, never really. There's all kinds of colors in nature. So for a different pastel drawing I did that was all grayscale was the African gray. And that was just because I was figuring out pastels. And grayscale was pretty simple and easy and fun. And I liked the result. But in this one, it is a gray donkey. but I really like the depth that adding some blue underneath brings. And when you're doing that, it doesn't have to be as defined as the color of the fur is, like my grays, my blacks, all that. It really just has to be a very light general glaze of color. Just something to peek through, like you're looking in between bricks. It's that mortar in between is the color underneath that you want to have peeking through. So I don't know if you can tell here, but there's a general shape in each layer of the fur as it curves around towards the front of his face. And those lines of fur are going to be darker. So I'm going in and defining that little swoop, those lines of fur clusters coming forward. And a lot of this just has to do with training your eye. You back up, you look at the reference photo, not zoom in too much, and you kind of see where the darkest areas, the darkest lines of fur are, and then further detail that as you go. And with these pencils, you can go in and just lightly shade out a dark area if you're just not sure. And then just back up and see how that looks, and then build on that with midtones and then highlights. It's very forgiving. And I also like to use pastel matte. Right now this is a 9x12 anthracite color pastel matte. And I love pastel matte because you can put so many layers on. It's great for building up fur, because you can just start with a black or a mid-tone. I don't like to start with lighter colors because that's generally not going to look as, or it's not going to be as easy to build on, I guess. But you can start with just a mid-tone or black and then just build and build and build on that if your pencil strokes are pretty light. So you can see on the lower cheek there, it was pretty dark in my reference photo. So I kept that area dark and then later build on it with more midtones to bring it out. You can also use pan pastels or soft pastels that aren't pencils for the underpainting or the under layer, the first layer of this. And I did that for some of my other pieces. And that's fine too, because you can just build on that, build on that. But for this piece, I think pretty much almost the whole time I'm just working with the pencils. So the way I use my black, I'm not using that to shade every dark fur. I'm using that in primarily the corners, the edges of the darkest areas of the fur. And then it's kind of a, you lift your pencil as you move down the length of the fur clump. It's like a sweeping, gentle little lift motion from the base where it's darkest out. So all my little pencil strokes, they start slightly harder than I finish them. I lift it up after each stroke. And that will ensure that the darkest areas are right underneath each layer of fur where it would be darkest. And then as it gets farther away from the fur above it, it lightens up. That's how it looks in nature. You don't typically have just hard lines for your shadows. It's going to be a harder line, and then it sweeps away and gets lighter as it gets farther away from what's on top of it, blocking the light. So it's helpful to not think of this as fur until you get to the detailed part. It's helpful to just think of this as form. I don't know if you've had an art class as a kid and they have this ball that you're supposed to shade, like this circle, and you have to just basically look at it as form. It's super boring. You're just learning to shade a ball. But that's really the way you're looking at this. It's a ball morphed into the shape of a donkey. And you're just developing the form of it. Very lightly. It's very fun. Don't get stressed out about, oh, there's so many furs and so many details and all that. The cool thing about this is it looks super detailed at the end because you've layered all those furs on top of the form, but really it's so easy. It's really easy. It's just procedural memory. You get used to looking for the form first, and then you get used to adding more and more detail on top of that, and then it's not confusing at all, really. It just takes practice. So here on the bridge of his nose, where it kind of separates the white of his face, the front of his face, from his cheek area, you can tell there's a significant drop in light there. And that's because the light source is hitting the right side of his face, so our left, I guess, I don't know. And it's hitting that, but then on the side that we're working on right now, it's darker. So keep that in mind. Like I said before, the lightest parts that are getting hit are not going to have the darkest midtones and the darkest shadows as the darkest areas of the face. So I'm keeping that in mind here and not just using the same midtones all throughout. I'm seeing that definite line there and that's what I love about contrast too. There's more definite areas of light and shadow. It's easier to work with. But anyways, I don't know. I guess that's just something you pick up looking at this stuff a lot, is where there's a slope and then the light hits, and then on the other side of where the light hits, it's all like a different terrain. So keeping that in mind, not making it all look the same. The key here is depth. You want depth. And light, shadow, form will give you depth. Detail won't. Detail gives interest and realism, but you need to start with finding the depth, finding the form, and finding where all your lights and darks are. So here I am just building up that area at the bottom of his cheek where it's going to be the darkest. Not just going in and throwing down shadows for this. I'm kind of sculpting. I like that word. Sculpting out all the shadows very lightly. Now, some people will say don't use black in your art because it will look flat. I do not listen to these people. I think you can have amazing art that is not flat and use lots of black too. That's just me. I also use paint color straight out of the tube. When a lot of people say you need to mix it all from scratch, it's just preference, honestly. But what you can do to make your blacks not look flat, or look more deep, I guess, is do what I did with the blues and the browns. I'm lightly glazing in some other colors, I guess. Blues and browns are just my favorite because they look so natural with black. And with each other, they complement each other really well. So as I am making my deepest, darkest shadows with this black, I am making sure to go in with some blue to bring out a little bit more depth there. Not necessary, but it's a really nice touch, and it will silence the haters. It's those things that in the finished piece, you're like, oh my gosh, there's so many colors in there. How did they do it? And you're like, oh, it was so easy. All I did was add a little bit of blue and brown or whatever, just lightly as I layered. And that's it. It's so easy. And then here you are, further defining that area, but staying light with it. You really don't have to press hard, especially with Faber-Castell pastel pencils. They are awesome. It's so light. I'm just very lightly making these little strokes in the direction of the fur until I get more depth. I don't need to go in with hard lines, if that makes sense, or hard pressure. The hardest pressure can come when you're trying to really fill the final tooth and you aren't planning on adding any more layers. So for example, the white in his eye, that little light spot, I'm not editing that anymore. That's the way it's going to be. So I went in there really hard actually with my white pencil. But for these furs and building these layers here, I know I'm going to be adding more, so I'm not going to be pushing really hard because then it'll be kind of crushing the tooth of the paper, which allows me to add more texture and build up more color. So I think I'm holding a brown here. And a lot of this is just looking at your reference photo and seeing, okay, I see a little bit of brown in that area, and then you can kind of amplify it in your artwork. Oh no, this is a gray, my bad, but still. So I'm finding where those midtones and lighter midtones are, even in the darkest areas. And you're gonna find that they're not gonna be, how do I explain this? You know, where the darkest areas are, underneath those clumps, where the darkest little shadows are. Generally, it's a general rule of thumb that your lighter areas of the fur will be on the opposite side as the shadow. So I'm kind of just following that, I guess. I hope that makes sense. You're basically working on the other side of your shadows when it comes to shading each clump of fur. So you have shadow under the previous clump of fur, and then you have your midtones, and if it comes up and catches light, then you have your highlight on the fur. But you build that up. I like to build it up from the shadows. And to add interest, when you're doing realism like this, to add interest, you don't want to just go in and shade a whole area exactly the same way. I take my time and make sure that it looks varied, because in real life, it's pretty rare that all the furs or all the feathers or whatever are going to be flat, going in the same direction and the same shape. With a donkey, he's got pretty fluffy fur here. I mean, he looks it's a little rugged and soft. So to keep with that and not make him look too polished, I do have some of my strokes, some of my clusters waving off in different directions by small amounts. So I don't know, I just really like that because it adds some motion. So don't just go in the direction and get all serious about it and be like, okay, it's like a ball in the face of a donkey, I'm going to shade it, and this is the dark and this is the light. And remember to play a little too with the motion of the fur. There's going to be some that wisps a little one way, wisps a little another way, but still follows that form. So take your time. Love pastel pencils because they're so forgiving. If you find that you really hate what you just did and it doesn't work, at least you were using light pressure, and you can now smudge it out a little bit with your finger or a soft tool and then go over it and try a different direction. Or just keep developing it with lighter lights or darker darks depending on what it needs. But it's so forgiving, so there's no reason to be scared about just going in and mapping out where the darks are, where the lights are, because you can just keep building and building. Down here at the bottom of his cheek, it's the same principle of kind of starting with slightly more pressure with the dark as we're underneath the fur above it, and then wisping it off. Some beginners also tend to pretty literally define the ends of the fur as well, and that's a mistake because that is not what it looks like in nature. You don't have every fur defined like a cluster of fur at the end, like each point. That's why I'm saying like start at the base of each cluster of fur with a dark and then like lift your pencil as you hit the end of it, because you want that delicate end of fur look. I'm not defining the ends of each fur. The ends of each fur cluster will be defined by the fur cluster underneath it, giving it shape because there's a shadow there. Think about that, if that made sense. You are defining every layer of fur by the shadow underneath it and the shadow that it has from the fur over it. So there's going to be less definition when there's less contrast and less shadow for that reason. Okay, and here I'm seeing that there's some light layering in my photograph, my reference photo. It's not a very defined line, but I'm starting to see where there's layers of fur that aren't heavily contrasted. So I'm just kind of going in with some midtones and scoping out those lines, breaking up those hairs a little bit. It's getting a little more detailed in this area. Not everything has to be shaded with black, nor should it. So you're going to look a little closer as you start developing more and more, and then get more precise and go, okay, there's a layer there, but you can't really see it because it's like midtones shading those layers, not blacks. So you have to kind of take that a little lighter. If it's all looking pretty flat, like, oh no, this whole area looks like midtones, but I don't want to go darker, bring in some lighter midtones and a little bit of highlight and give it a little bit of form that way. It doesn't all have to be shaded with black, nor should it all just be washed out as one midtone. And if you're finding that an area is looking real good, but it's kind of boring and flat in color, that's where it's really nice to have added some complementary tones for some visual interest. So in my midtones there, because I added some blue and a little bit of brown earlier, it looks like a more interesting gray, a more real gray, versus just black, white, and gray shaping out a face. Although that might be nice too, depending on what you're going for. Now at the point where we're further defining the smaller clumps of fur. So first we started with the bigger areas, the bigger clumps, and now we're at the point where we're saying, okay, we got the form pretty much down. Now we can kind of go in with even tinier little strokes to define smaller clumps and smaller shadows in between these furs. If you find that you're getting a little bit shadow happy, you can do what I'm doing here with your finger and just kind of gently smudge it out as you work. Another thing that's so great with pastels, just gently smudge it out as you work. Kind of keep it blending and going. Also, if it's starting to look really grainy from the tooth of the paper and you're like, okay, that's a little bit too much green, but I like what I'm doing here, you can kind of just gently rub it in. And smudging is fine and all that, but you want to make sure that you've got your hand on a tracing paper or what I've got here. It's the paper that they put in between each pastel mat paper to protect it in the pad. And use that so that your hand isn't smudging all your work below. That's actually something that people don't like about pastels, is how smudgy they are. You have to just be careful with them. I like how smudgy they are. It's why I like to work with oils, is because they're also very workable the whole way through. But the same thing with oils, it's like they're always wet. So you have to be careful or you'll smudge all your work. And all right, here we are with the lighter midtones and the highlights. We've already developed the form in this area, and so now it's the fun part of, well, one of the fun parts of going through with our light color and still following the shape and form and movement of all the hairs and hair clusters, but very lightly just defining where it's light. So it's not going to be on all the furs, all the fur clusters, and all of the ends of all the furs. You're just looking back and forth between your reference photo and your drawing and seeing where it needs more light, where it's lighter, and then just going in those areas and very lightly applying some pressure and light strokes to add that depth. So shadows are what push it back, and lights are what bring it forward. So that's actually why I like to work from dark to light. It's kind of like you're actually working from the bottom of, like you shaved the animal, and then forward until you get to the very top with all your little highlights. It's like you've actually built that whole depth. So that's what makes it pop and look three-dimensional. But yeah, it does help psychologically too to see it that way, is you're not drawing this reference photo. You are drawing the animal, like creating it from the bottom layers to the very top layers, the very finishing touches, the highlights. Well, I hope you enjoyed this demo fur tutorial video. If you have any comments or suggestions or you'd like to see more, please let me know. And thank you so much for watching.